Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I want to interrupt your conversations, but wanted to go ahead and get started. Let me say what a great pleasure and honor it is for me to be here. Thanks to Priscilla, to Sarah, and to Katie, who will be back in a moment, for your wonderful hospitality and the very kind invitation to have me come and talk to you today. I will be some introductions in a moment, so I don't need to do that. But and for the moment, I just wanted to say thank you all for your hospitality, and I'll defer to the two gentlemen who are introducing me to get started, and then we'll take it away.
All righty. So Dr. Mark Vail is the Worrell Chair of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University. Professor Vail specializes in comparative political economy of advanced industrial countries and is an expert in political science, economics, and ideology. He's published 2 books, Liberalism in a Liberal States, Ideas and Economic Adjustment in Contemporary Europe, and Recasting Welfare Capitalism, Economic Adjustment in Contemporary France and Germany. In addition, Professor Vail has produced dozens of publications and won more than 20 grants, fellowships, awards, and honors. He earned his PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and taught at Tulane University for over 15 years before coming to Wake Forest in 2021. Professor Vail has also held visiting positions at a number of other universities, such as Harvard, Humboldt University in Berlin, where some of us will be going, and the University of Duisburg-Essen.
Professor Vail's journey in the field of political science wasn't always as straightforward as his qualifications may suggest. Initially, he wasn't too interested in political science, but through taking general education courses at UT's liberal arts program, developed a deeper appreciation for the field of political science. Initially, his interest in Europe didn't revolve around its political landscape. Instead, he was drawn to Europe for its rich cultural dimensions. And because of this rich cultural dimensions, he decided to study abroad in France. And it's through his time at studying abroad that he developed this deeper, profound appreciation for the culture of Europe, as well as a deeper appreciation for it as a political space. During his time at the Fletcher School, he delved into subjects such as political science, political economy, and governance, which significantly contributed to the development of his analytical lens as a political economist. He attributes his time at Fletcher for shaping his approach to political analysis, as well as the perspective he's carried with him through not just his postdoc career, but also now as his teaching suggests. Please join us in welcoming Professor Vail.
Thank you very much. And let me say also thanks to all of you for being here on a Friday afternoon now. I know this is perhaps not the number one place you would expect to find yourself on a Friday afternoon, so I appreciate your time and your attention in what is already probably a very busy semester. Today I'm going to talk for about 35 or 40 minutes about what I call patterns of contentious politics in France under neoliberalism. And in so doing, I'm going to set forth a series of arguments that I think cut against the grain of sort of stereotypical conventional views of French politics. In doing that, I'm going to talk then about a couple of episodes, the Gilets jaunes or Yellow Vest protest in 2018, 2019, and the more recent pension protest against Emmanuel Macron's proposed and now enacted pension reforms this year and in 2021. These are merely 2 episodes in a longer story of a pattern whereby French labor is both marginalized and activated by the sort of arrogations of power by the French executive. And this is a pattern that goes back to the 1950s, and one which I think helps us understand, not as mere anecdotes, but as a broader historical and historically contextualized pattern, a really, if not unique, at least distinctive pattern of labor politics in France compared to many other of its European neighbors. Having studied France professionally for now 20 years, I have come to the impression that France is different. This sounds both obvious and uninteresting, except when you drill down into that claim a little further. It fits awkwardly, if at all, in conventional models of European politics and political economy. The varieties of capitalism paradigm of Peter Hall and David Soskice and their followers in that initiative. The more recent work on growth models by Jonas Pontussen and Mark Blythe and Lucio Baccaro. In that book, the growth model is called Diminishing Returns, which is a fantastic edited volume in a world in which many edited volumes are not. Nonetheless, the index to that book, which comprises over 550 pages, has a mere 3 lonely references to France. I think that is not an accident. Simply put, political scientists and comparative politics experts, except those who work specifically on France, don't really know what to do with France. France is different, it's distinctive, it's difficult, and it doesn't fit necessarily easily into established boxes. It's neither a liberal market economy in the Anglo-American style, here I'm using Soskice and Hall's language, nor a sort of standard neo-corporatist model of institutionalized interest groups like, say, Germany or Austria, nor a social democratic country in the mold of, say, Sweden or Denmark. Decades of scholarship on France, mostly not in a comparative perspective, but even that which is, tend to see it as a case that's sort of sui generis, a case unto itself that is really in some respects incomparable. That is a, a conceit to which the French are in their own distinctive ways also oddly attached. A few examples: classic work on French political economy, Andrew Schoenfeld's masterful and magisterial work, Modern Capitalism in 1965, Peter Hall's fantastic work on France and Britain, entitled Governing the Economy, Jonah Levy's 1999 book called Tocqueville's Revenge. With some passing references to comparability, all of these books treat France as a prototypically statist economy, one that builds on a centuries-long tradition of concentrated power that, as any, and I'm sure many of you are in this category, any student of French politics will be able to tell you, was only successfully and then tenuously reconciled with democratic politics under the Constitution of the Fifth Republic in 1958. These works tend to focus on France's uniqueness, its peculiarities, its distinctiveness, leading to a kind of model of or discourse of French exceptionalism, right? A kind of doctrine, a variant of which we're familiar with in this country, obviously, but one which sort of argues that you can't really compare apples to oranges, and France is an apple and everything else is an orange. In this doctrine of incomparability, one of the things that French political scientists and scholars of French politics tend to point to is the distinctive role of the state. For complex historical and cultural reasons, and because, in part at least, of its ostensible incomparability, France is viewed as a thing apart. But this is not merely an institutional claim, it's also a cultural claim. France is often, as some of you may be aware, as a result of its sort of inscrutability to Anglo-American audiences, subject to a series of jokes, French interests, French citizens' tendencies to, Kayla, can you flip, maybe, can we work on that? In addition to the overwhelming role and the distinctive role of the state, one of the things, and this gets to my current topic today, one of the things that those who argue that France is incomparable like to point to is its ostensible culture of protest, right? The view which, echoing Charles Tilly's famous argument about the contentious French in that great book in the 1980s, argues that protest is simply a part of French culture. That, like the baguette and the beret, it is something that's just distinctively French, and seeking to understand it as anything other than a cultural artifact is more or less futile. One anecdote, well, we see if we can get the slides going again. A German friend of mine, Achim Dörnes, who is at the University of Duisburg-Essen, sent me in jest a YouTube video a couple of weeks ago, knowing that I was preparing a talk on France and I work on France. A fictionalized presentation, absurd as well, of a French customs official, immigration official, interviewing 2 ostensibly American entrants into the country who wished to be admitted to France. The whole premise is silly, but it was a device for a joke. So we can excuse that. One of the many questions the French immigration official asked the American entrants or potential entrants was, what is the French national pastime? And they quickly and without hesitation answered protest. The French official said, that is correct, let us move on. to the next question. So obvious is this, not even to be controversial to the French immigration official himself, let alone the two somewhat pressured American immigrants. This is a history that goes back a long way, obviously, right? You all studied about the French Revolution, the Vendée Rebellion, the reactionary counter-revolution in its wake, the long tortured political history of the 19th century. Can you go back a slide? One more. There. Can you stop there for a minute? Thanks. And maybe I can just do that without being rude when I want you to flip. Thanks. And more recently, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, the near revolution of May 1968. All of these episodes going on for more than 2 centuries yield a portrait of France that is always ready to explode. And on some level, perhaps, though the French elites dare not say it, is more or less ungovernable. Although there are certainly ample historical examples of contentious French politics, I've named a couple just now, I would suggest that these portrayals are a classic example of confusing outcome for cause, and in some cases border on the tautological. Why do the French protest? Because protest is culturally embedded in French politics. Why is protest culturally embedded in French politics? Because the French like to protest. Why do the French like to protest? Because they're French, et cetera, and so on and so forth. Around goes the tautological wheel until you have nothing to claim at all. Today, I'm going to advance a somewhat different and I hope more persuasive argument than it's all about the state or it's all about an irreducible French culture that really thinks about the pattern of French historical protest, French political protest in its historical context. To make sense of why the French so often resort to the kind of protest that is so easy to caricature, but so hard to understand. And why that tends to happen, particularly in the case of economic policy. I suggest that, and I'll explain this slide in a moment, I suggest that there are 2 factors in particular that help us make sense of this somewhat distinctive historical trajectory. The first, and perhaps the most important, is the institutional character of the post-war statist economy, the concentration of authority in the executive, the marginalization of interest groups, but in particular, the way in which that model has been deployed by French elites and politicians and officials since the 1980s. Anticipating my point later in the talk a little bit, my argument is that this model, which can be deployed in a number of different ways, has been deployed in an increasingly authoritarian and exclusive way, even by French standards, which is saying something in ways that have both exacerbated political unrest and made a sort of lasting social contract and political settlement more and more elusive. The second and related factor, I suggest, that helps explain this sort of distinctive French pattern is the rise of neoliberalism as a hegemonic economic ideology in the 1980s and 1990s, and in particular, how certain elements of that program, that agenda, have been interpreted and implemented by French political officials, particularly since the late 1980s. I'll talk about each of those more in detail in a moment. Together, I argue that these factors help to explain not only the frequency and amplitude of French protests, but also their content, the questions that are on the agenda to be contested, and the way in which those have played out over time. In my talk today, the rest of my talk today, I'm going to situate those patterns in their proper historical context, and I'm going to present a case about why this pattern has emerged in France. I'm then going to describe 2 recent episodes of political contestation that I think are particularly illustrative of some of these underlying political and institutional factors. The first, as I mentioned a moment ago, the so-called Gilets jaunes, or yellow vest protest of 2018 and 2019, and the more recent protest against President Emmanuel Macron's proposed pension reforms, 2 iterations of this since 2017. I'll then end my talk with a series of brief comments about the implications of these episodes for French democracy and the wider contestation of 30 years of neoliberal market governance in the French Republic. I say as a long but emphasized footnote that part of the content of my talk today draws on some of the work that I and 2 other co-authors did in developing the article, the citation of which I have on the board on the screen right now, which was published in April 2023 in Comparative Politics, one of whom, Sarah Watson, is a bachelor's alumna of the political science department at UNC, was indeed a student of John Stevens before she and I met at Berkeley in the same cohort in 1997, A Small World. Flip. Kayla, could you flip? So the background, flip one more time. One can go back to the French Revolution, but we don't have that kind of time. In the interest of brevity, I choose to to situate my historical narrative beginning in May to June 1968. This was a period, those of you who studied French history will know this episode quite well, which witnessed a prolonged wave of often violent unrest that many feared would end in an actual revolution, that would end the Fifth Republic, that would dismantle French democracy in favor of either a incoherent and radicalized Marxist alternative or some new variant of authoritarianism, flavors of which the French had re-embraced at multiple points during the 19th century. This was not a new model for French citizens. This episode was prompted by two factors in particular. One, and perhaps most importantly, it was prompted by university students, more or less you a couple of years ago, chafing at the obviously and increasingly opaque and unresponsive nature of the French Fifth Republic and the politics of elite dominance. Second, and equally important, it was prompted by and then joined by workers, many of whom, particularly manual workers and industrial workers, many of whom felt, not without reason, that the rapid economic growth of the post-war period in France was not being equitably shared between labor and capital. Capital and profits were increasing apace, while labor and wages and working conditions for labor continued to languish. Improved though they were from their post-war baseline, nonetheless, there was a real sense that the profits and fruits of the post-war boom were not being equitably shared. In order to understand this context in turn, we need to return briefly to World War II or the immediate aftermath, during which French officials were determined, come hell or high water, to drag France out of its sleepy, agrarian, sclerotic path, many of which was blamed by many of them for the disastrous outcomes that France had experienced between 1944, and drag France, willingly or not, into the industrial present, to make of it a dynamic, robust, advanced industrial economy in a way that it had not succeeded in becoming in the 1920s and 1930s. This model involved the identification of so-called national champion firms, which would act as sort of the international vanguard of French capitalism, developing a presence in international markets and generating economic growth, but also through an equally important element that involved the exclusion of labor. The labor exclusionary model, the model that said that labor was not trustworthy, they were parochial, they were self-serving, they were children. Many French leaders of French firms actually openly characterized them as such, spoiled children that needed to be disciplined rather than listened to, in a formulation that was somewhat less incendiary and a little more formal. Andrew Schoenfeld, in that book, Modern Capitalism, that I mentioned a moment ago, characterized this model as as he put it, a conspiracy in the public interest between big business and the state. That's a pretty straightforward formulation. You'll notice what's not in that formulation, namely labor. This impetus, this rationale was prompted not only by the condescension that many French firms and political elites felt towards workers, but also by the Gaullist center-right's distrust and prevailing view that workers' views were orthogonal to or inconsistent with the modernizing project. That capitalism, as it were, was too important to be left to workers. They needed to learn their place and get in line with the project that was, in their view at least, supportive of the improvement of the broader national interest. These pretensions, these sort of arrogant ideas notwithstanding, 1968 presented French officials with a starkly different reality. It turned out, and here's one slide from a protest in 1968, I'll translate a couple of these things in a moment for those of you who don't read French, revealed a very different, starkly different, actually, political and economic landscape. It turned out, great shock to many, that large segments of the French public felt increasingly excluded, marginalized, and that the French social contract was indeed quite fragile, and it relied much more on power than on consent. Here's an image, not inconsiderable image, of strikers at a Renault auto factory. It's worth noting that Renault was a state-owned enterprise at this time. One of the very national champion firms was supposed to lead France out of its agrarian past into prosperity. You can see how well the consent is going in this picture. This was one of 1,000 such photos that one could choose. In preparing this talk, I actually found myself with an embarrassment of riches of such scenes from 1968, and this was the one I settled on. So what happened? In the wake of the strikes of May and June 1968, which finally fizzled out in that summer, put down not inconsiderably in some instances by force, French officials tread carefully. They regularly and consistently sought to bring France's historically radical trade unions on board so that this would not happen again, but also that France's modernization project of developing capitalism could proceed without interference by troublesome workers. Unions' radicalism, here again, a short footnote, those of you who study French history will know this story, was born in part of the slow pace of industrialization in the 19th century, the resulting very small size of the working class, and in a sort of vicious circle, both the political marginalization of workers and their radicalism, which tended to feed on one another in a tradition that came to be known as anarcho-syndicalism. Syndicalism referring to unions and small worker cooperatives, and anarcho, well, you know what that means. In the wake of 1968, French officials sought to, or hoped, to create more robust institutions of industrial relations in an effort to borrow Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's phrase, manufacture consent, to create institutions that, in reality, but equally important in appearance, suggested that French workers were, after all, not marginalized from the French project and had a place at the proverbial table. As scholars such as Chris Howell and Oberlin and Jonah Levy have shown, both employer hostility and a misplaced faith in institutions on the firm level basically ensured that this plan would be born without much effect. Firm level institutions, works councils, for example, whereby workers were supposed to be able to negotiate with firms on working conditions and wages, having been historically operating at a sectoral or even national level, now operated at a firm level, which gave firm owners the upper hand and ensured that the workers' voice would be increasingly marginalized. The so-called Auroux laws of 1982 and other measures that ostensibly were designed to bolster French industrial relations actually weakened them to the extent that they relegated negotiations to the firm level. In the 1980s and 1990s, what increasingly held the French social contract together was not robust industrial relations, was not an inclusive attitude towards labor, but nor was it mere oppression. It was instead an odd hybrid of marginalization and compensation, resulting in a series of side payments of various potentially troublesome segments of the French working class, some of which involved one-off measures such as restrictions on the size of supermarkets that were designed to placate concerned small shopkeepers, the sort of standard Walmartization of French commercial space, designed to sort of placate small shopkeepers, which had historically been quite troublesome. But more importantly to our purpose, this involved the beginning of a 3 decades long massive expansion of the French welfare state. The bargain here was this. Those of you who've read Carl Polanyi will recognize this as an example of his characterization of the double movement. You expand market forces and make workers more vulnerable to deregulated labor market arrangements. You take away protections such as restrictions on work time and overtime and part-time work, even as you undertake a massive expansion of social protection designed to compensate and anesthetize the French working class to buy social peace in a context in which it could not be manufactured as an outcome of industrial growth alone. Thank you for your help with this, by the way. Grab my water for a moment. So here what you have is a admittedly somewhat foreshortened graph on the increase in French social spending relative to the OECD average. This is aggregate social spending as a percentage of gross domestic product, basically how much of your gross domestic product you spend on the welfare state broadly defined. What you can see here in about 5 seconds is that and already considerably above the OECD average in 1990, during the very period that I'm describing, this period of the 80s and 90s where the French are trying to piece together or reassemble their social contract, you see a massive increase of almost a sixth relative to the size of the economy as a whole by the end of the 1990s. This level remains relatively stable. It, of course, jumps up sharply in the aftermath of the Great Recession and the financial crisis of 2007, as you would expect, and then continues steadily to increase until COVID. And this spike here is obviously results from the measures undertaken in the aftermath of the advent of the pandemic. This is a classic example of trying to buy social peace. Industrial relations institutions had failed. The political system in France was already highly concentrated and already highly subject to blame and recrimination. And so the choice, the very expensive choice that French elites opted for, was to compensate workers and basically pay them not to protest. Jonah Levy, in a separate work of his, calls this the social anesthesia state. Basically, you modernize, you liberalize, you marginalize labor from the bargain, but you pay them off over time to, as it were, numb them to the displacement and dislocation that market expansion results in. This pattern goes back actually to 1981, the year in which a socialist president, François Mitterrand, finally, having won the presidency from the hegemonic Gaullists for the first time since the 1950s, the left undertook a massive expansion of public spending in the welfare state, nationalizing banks, imposing capital controls, all in an effort in the early 1980s to turn France into something like a French version of social democracy, something like a French workers' republic, something that you might have compared to Sweden at the apogee of the social democratic experiment in the mid-1960s. For a complex series of reasons, which I don't have time to go into today, but I'm happy to answer questions about in the Q&A, in the manner sort of Lucy pulling the proverbial football away from Charlie Brown, Mitterrand reversed course in 1983 with a classic example of what came to be called a U-turn, involving not only the rescission of the expansion of social protection that took place in the early 1980s, leading to a level of something like a quarter of GDP, up from about 13% in the 1970s, but an actual complete dismantling of the dirigy system itself. Industrial policy was dismantled and ended. Indicative price controls were completely abolished. Foreign capital controls were done away with. Previously nationalized industries, such as the entire banking system, were privatized. And a rash of privatization and liberalization that would have, and probably did at the time, make Margaret Thatcher blush in appreciation and admiration. This shift from state to market as the operating logic of the political economy was balanced, however, as you can see here, by a continued expansion of the safety net, process that I have called, in other words, a process of socialized marketization. You expose workers to market vagaries, you abolish controls on the use of overtime and supplemental time, you loosen restrictions on working conditions. At the same time, you can tend to supplement them and pacify them through the massive expansion of programs such as early retirement programs designed to take older workers out of the labor market, ostensibly, therefore, to create new opportunities for newer workers. It then would become doubly tragic and ironic that those very retirement programs would become the target of reformers in subsequent decades. But I'll get to that in a moment. Suffice it to say, at this time, French officials showed that they had learned at least one lesson from 1968. You can't marketize and expose workers to market vagaries without some form of compensation in a highly statist system in which blame is difficult, if not impossible, to share. At the same time, as I've mentioned, neoliberalism was quickly becoming a prevailing standard ideology of market governance, so much so that it was branded by many of its Washington consensus acolytes in the United States as something like religiously revealed truth, rather than a specific political project with a specific set of political policy and institutional aims. French authorities, in their own flavor of this recipe, sort of tapped into this market logic in the same way, similar to the way, for example, Tony Blair did in Britain and Bill Clinton in the United States, that viewed, with some exceptions and some modifications, the market as the answer to all meaningful economic problems. The way to address problems with the market was more market rather than compensating efforts by the state. During this period and against this background, French labor politics settled into an uneasy pattern, one which reflected the continued tensions between the labor exclusionary model and the expansion of social protection, but one that increasingly sought institutional outlets that were harder and harder to find. Here, in a pattern of what Chris Howell has aptly called virtual unionism, France's overwhelmingly public sector unions, the CGT, the CFDT, and all the rest of them, though dominated in their membership by public sector workers, increasingly took on a representational role for private sector workers as well. In Howell's formulation, they serve the role of channeling worker grievances towards the state, irrespective of whether those workers happen to be in the private or public sector. They were, as it were, unofficial representatives, hence virtual, of the French working class, many of whom were not actual members, but in particular context, many of whom were quite willing to support union protests and efforts to destabilize French capitalism. The classic example of this came in 1995 to 1996, when Prime Minister Alain Juppé, Gaullist heir of Charles de Gaulle, attempted to cut back and privatize elements of France's social insurance system, notably its pension and healthcare systems, which led to the greatest outbreak of protest since 1968. More than 1 million people were on the street during December of 95 and January of 96. Basically, the entire Paris metro was shut down. Air France flights weren't flying. The Paris metro wasn't working. Suburban trains weren't working. Even long distance trains were only operating 1 out of 5 times. And there were real questions at the time. I remember taking a class from Peter Hall and Suzanne Berger when I was at Fletcher at Harvard. The question of the day was, will the private sector come out in the street? The answer turned out more or less to be no, which meant that France had a really serious destabilizing protest on its hands rather than a revolution. But the fact that educated, highly trained political economists who were experts in French politics were asking this question showed how volatile and destabilizing the situation was. The protests in 95, 96 did result in the rescission and modification of many of Juppé's proposals, but they left a mark. And they really represented the high water mark, with one exception, which I'll mention in a moment, of the virtual union model. The idea that private sector workers would kind of put their faith in public sector unions to represent their grievances against the state and to express their discontent at labor market deregulation and cuts in social protection. Can you flip? Next graph. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the ensuing Great Recession, France saw a massive spike in unemployment. This is 2006, this is 2009, 2010, and upward it goes from there. Just to give you a sense of context, this is the OECD average, right? So France both accelerated faster in terms of unemployment rates than the OECD average and was at a higher absolute rate. This basically destroyed any pretense that the French economic model could continue to work for and deliver the goods for workers across the board. This period also represented the beginning of the mounting authoritarianism that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. The increasing frequency with which French officials would not bother negotiating reforms, such as a reform by Nicolas Sarkozy's administration in the late 2000s of the unemployment insurance system, which was supposed to be negotiated with workers and union and employer representatives, but instead imposed these reforms more or less without consultation. Here, the growing authoritarianism of the French state was both a symptom and a reinforcing cause of the breakdown of industrial relations and the unavailability of meaningful negotiating fora. Such moves, as I said, exacerbated the already considerable political liabilities suffered by the French system by virtue of its centralization, right? And by virtue of the fact that the French state was the proverbial 700-pound gorilla, the only entity in the room. When things went good, went well, it was happy to take credit, but when things went badly, everyone knew who to blame. This pattern was, as I'll talk about in a moment, would find its clearest incarnation with the presidency of Emmanuel Macron and his attempted pension and labor market reforms after 2017. A Macron who, without irony, apparently compared himself to Jupiter, the head Roman god, presiding over the fates of his believers and taking care of the trivial exploits and problems of mere earthlings. At the same time, if you could flip again here, please, Caleb. The previous strategy of expanding the welfare state to buy social peace reached its limits. Here on this graph, you can see tax revenue as share of GDP. This is the OECD average, more or less stable at 45%. And here you can see French tax revenue. Here plus at 30%. The French average is already well above this and consistently so. But here you see French government debt going up from 1995 from about 65% of GDP to 2017, at which it's already well over 100% of GDP. So France owes more than it makes as a share of the economy. Flip again, please. And again. So by the time Macron's presidency rolled around in 2017, French labor politics were at their most volatile and unsettled since the late 1960s. 2 decades of erosion of national level collective bargaining and growing authoritarianism by the French executive shut off mechanisms of democratic legitimation and accelerated the breakdown of societal consensus. Tapping into the long tradition of labor radicalism, which I've already talked about, French workers were ready to protest. And they were really, in some respects, now focused more on bringing down the regime and delegitimizing and attacking the basic legitimacy of French democracy than they were concerned about bread and butter issues such as wages and working conditions. Macron's presidency witnessed 2 episodes of labor unrest, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute. The first of which was the so-called Yellow Vest protest or Gilets jaunes protest of 2018 and 2019. Here's an image from a protest in Marseille in late 2018. Does anybody know where the yellow vest image comes from? Any students of French politics in here who might know? Anybody driven in Europe?
You're saying in France, everybody's required to have a yellow vest in their car.
Exactly. It's a yellow safety vest, right? That French law requires that all people who have a driver's license have in their car in case they have a breakdown, so they on the side of the road, they don't get hit by a passing vehicle. This became the sort of signal symbol of the yellow vest protest, which dominated French politics in 2018 and 2019. Initially, the protests were sparked by Macron's decision or proposal to raise the gasoline tax, right? Sounds like a more or less innocuous move, right? Governments do this all the time. But there are a couple things you have to remember about this context. First, the French outside of Paris and major agglomerations in their subway and their suburbs use their cars a lot, right? We have this image of France as this public transportation paradise. Anybody who's been to Paris and used the metro knows how wonderful it is. Unfortunately, most of France is not like that. And it turns out that French workers tend to use and need to use their cars a lot to get back and forth to work and to get back to the increasingly rare and increasingly consolidated supermarkets at which they have to shop. The other problem with this is that beginning in the 1980s, François Mitterrand, the socialist president, remember him? Well, one of the things he did, other than undertaking a massive U-turn on the French savings system, was to expand the network of high-speed rail in France. Anybody been on the TGV? It's a thing of beauty, right? It goes 300 kilometers an hour, gets you from Paris to Bordeaux in 2 hours. Who doesn't like that? Well, not everybody's going from Paris to Bordeaux. It turns out that many people need and have historically needed trains to operate regionally and even locally to take them from small town to small town. One of the things that Mitterrand's governments did, even as they undertook a massive investment in an expansion in high-speed rail, was slowly to dismantle local and regional rail networks that many French workers needed to get from job to home and home to job in areas that were outside the exalted confines of Paris, Marseille, and other large urban areas. So the gas tax that Macron proposed hit a real nerve, right? Hit a nerve because French gasoline, like as in many countries in Europe, is already 3 to 4 times as expensive as in the United States, something like the order of $8 a gallon, right? If you want to convert the currency and convert the measure. So they're already paying a great deal of money. Real wages had stagnated since the early 2000 aughts, and real cost of living had increased. Public transportation was increasingly unavailable. And so these long-standing grievances over real wages, the cost of living, and the cost of transportation, and Macron's arrogance and insouciant way of governing yielded an unexpected outbreak, not only in its existence, but in its scope of a protest, the likes of which had not been seen since the 1960s and arguably since 1968. The motto of these protests, there were many, but one of the most salient, one of the most famous, and I think one of the most indicative, was as follows. Les élites parlent de la fin du monde, quand on parle de la fin du mois. The elites are talking about the end of the world. Global warming, the gasoline tax, the desire to decrease gasoline consumption, whereas we're worried about the end of the month. We're worried about making ends meet and paying the rent, right? We can't afford to indulge in the sort of environmental idealism that the wealthy elites in Paris can indulge in. I'm not saying that's a justifiable point of view, but that was really very much the crux of the focus. The protests, which at their height in late 2018 saw 300,000 daily protesters come out over dozens of weekends, also operated on a symbolic level, representing failures of representation in democratic politics that have been developing for over 3 decades. Here you have a French protester in, where was this from? Paris, with a sort of pithy summary of his position. It rhymes in French. It doesn't really work in English as a rhyme. Macron démission means Macron resign, right? So there's no doubt in many of these people's minds who they're mad at. This is not some generic anger against the cost of living. It is very much focused on Macron and his government, something that in a statist system like France is very easy to do. Unlike in the 1990s, however, the unions didn't really operate as an effective representational channel. Whereas in the 1990s, private sector workers were sort of willing to support union protests and say, yeah, we buy this. They're tapping into grievances that we share. The Gilets jaunes protests quickly went beyond the scope of union protest, and unions quickly became followers rather than leaders. Many of them dismissed the unions as parochial and out of touch, in part, ironically, because of their disproportionate concentration in public sector unions and of their members in the public among public sector employees. Here are some comments that Dan Driscoll, one of my co-authors in the article that I mentioned earlier, collected in among about 300 such interviews. A few examples to give you an idea of the tenor of the protest. These are anonymized and translated from French by Dan, but they give you an idea. The social fabric has been destroyed by capitalism for more than 50 years. That's to say the life of neighborhoods was broken. Small businesses were forced to close in favor of large companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're in the roundabouts, or in the roundabouts or traffic circles, or in the houses of the people, or in the protest, people find a social link. There they've rewoven social ties. Another, this is for me a real anti-capitalist movement. The economy is above our social life. It's dominating people. The problem is the financialization of the economy, neoliberalism. But the deeper problem is capitalist structure is the problem of the economy. If we're not working to produce, we're basically starving. And finally, reflecting the growing cynicism among Gilets jaunes protesters about the unions, most of the money is coming from the state or their corporate bosses. It means that unions exist mostly towards this end. That's why they're completely linked with everything. There's something a bit bizarre about unions in France. They're not going to end struggles. They're not on the left anymore. Hardly a ringing endorsement. And in the absence of public sector unions as the sole remaining channel of grievance production, it's hard to know where workers are supposed to go, right? There's not working on the sectoral level. Firm level negotiation is more or less defunct. Most people aren't in unions at all. They no longer have faith in the public sector unions. And so they go out in the streets. In interviews that I did, I realize I'm running slightly short of time, so I'll wrap up. In interviews that I conducted in 2020, union officials expressed equally focused contempt towards the unions. One CFDT official that I interviewed said, yeah, this movement was very strong and super impressive, but ultimately sterile. Didn't produce anything of consequence. Well, so the bargain even on the left, right, to secure some reasonably consistent form of representation for French workers is more or less broken. If the yellow vest protest reflected the possibilities of broad-based worker mobilization and the fact that much of it is now gone beyond the scope of union protests, Protest against President Macron's proposed pension reforms showed the fragility of the social contract established in the aftermath of May 1968. Macron's proposed pension reforms, initially at least, envisaged several important changes to the French pension system. The French pension system is Byzantine in its complexity. There are dozens of occupationally specific funds, each of which has different rules about contributions and retirement age and number of years that have to be worked and benefit levels, much of which was secured by manual workers who argued that the physically taxing and onerous nature of their job justified more generous retirement provisions, right? You work in a slaughterhouse, for example, and you have a very different experience from a white-collar worker working at a desk, however stressful that white-collar worker's job might be, of which I'm, of course, one. In 2019, the government proposed merging all of these separate funds under a single umbrella, which would be based on a point system, not unlike the American system of Social Security. Fearing that this would, I think not unreasonably, fearing that this would end many of the more generous provisions of these occupationally distinctive funds, the unions led protests that brought about 1.5 million people into the streets in December 2019. Far from limited to union concerns, however, the protests seem to represent a short-term revival of the virtual union model. Suddenly, people liked the unions again, not because they particularly had faith in the unions. We've seen that they didn't, but because the attack on pension rules for them represented a fundamental breach of the French social contract. 69% of the public supported the strikes in the initial wave. The highest rate of support for these strikes was not among workers who were about to retire, 50 to 55-year-olds or 60-year-olds, but 18 to 34-year-olds, right? So something's going on here. This is not a short-term economic calculation by people who are about to retire. This is a symbolically significant, deeply emotional investment in a certain way of arranging capitalism and a certain understanding of the state's obligations. And yeah, the unions were important, but one of the reasons the union protest worked in this context was because the networks already established by the Yellow Vest created a wellspring of discontent that the union protesters were able to tap into. Here again, the unions acted more as followers than as leaders. Can you flip? After Macron's re-election in 2022, having temporarily shelved the plan because of COVID, he revived the plan, but added an even more controversial provision, namely one that would raise the standard retirement age from 62 to 64. It's easy to chuckle, right? We in America are used to expecting that we work forever, or at least more or less forever. The idea of cozy retirement, we go down the Côte d'Azur and put up an umbrella and drink something cold on the beach, seems to many workers an increasingly remote prospect. But you also have to understand in this context that the French have always prided themselves on not being American in this regard, of having a different understanding of work-life balance, of having a different kind of understanding of what it means to be human, whereby we are not what we do, but we do things so that we can be, right? And that's a very different cultural set of understanding and expectations, and one which was directly threatened by the raise in the retirement age proposed by Macron. People were already angry, of course, at this point as well. This led to a social explosion. Train and subway service, can you flip please? Train and subway service was cut to a bare minimum. Airplanes did not fly. Here's an image of the union protest. Flip one more time, please. And garbage went uncollected for weeks. This echoes, those of you who study British history may remember the winter of discontent, right, of late 1978, early 1979, in which public sector workers went on strike for months to protest Labor Prime Minister James Callaghan's attempt to control wage increases. Bodies went unburied because the coroners were public sector employees, trash went uncollected. It wasn't quite this bad earlier this year in France, but this is quite an impressive array of garbage. You could pretty much go anywhere in any major city and see something similar. By the way, The French and the Parisians in particular are meticulously proud of the cleanliness of their city, right? You see these little placards all around Paris, Propreté de Paris, cleanliness of Paris. The first thing you hear in Paris when you wake up at 5:30 in the morning is not the bakers, not the people going to work, but the city sanitation workers spraying trash down the gutter into the sewer to make sure that the street is clean before the traffic starts in the morning. And from that, you end up with this. And this was not unintentional. It wasn't just about the attack on the retirement age. It was about the attack on the separately negotiated provisions for workers for whom their jobs were physically taxing. Philippe Martinez, the head of the CGT union, historically associated with the Communist Party, said during the strikes, 64, that is retirement age 64, isn't possible. Let them visit a textile factory floor or a slaughterhouse or the food processing industry, and they'll see what working conditions are like. This, of course, also reinforced impressions cultivated by Macron himself that he was a president of the rich. And to put the cherry on the sundae, because Macron, after having revived these reforms, understood that he could not secure a majority in the National Assembly, the lower house of parliament, to get these very controversial reforms through and implemented, he resorted to an obscure, well, maybe not so obscure anymore, provision of the 1958 Fifth Republic Constitution called Article 49.3. A term that only the French could love. A provision which was supposed to be used only in dire emergencies, national invasion, nuclear explosion, tsunami, right? To suspend the rule whereby laws had to be approved by Parliament and allow the executive to ram them through without parliamentary approval. Macron used it not for a nuclear catastrophe, not for a tsunami, not for any other kind of natural disaster, not for foreign invasion, but because he wanted to get his pension reform through, right? This almost becomes a self-parody of the statist system, right? I don't even have to pretend to care about Parliament anymore. I will talk for a while, then I'll do whatever I want, which was more or less on a parliamentary level the same thing that Nicolas Sarkozy had done to the unemployment insurance system in the late 2000s. The authoritarianism and the authoritarian potential of the French model was in sharp, was there for all to see in sharp relief. So Macron got his pension reform through. Congratulations, félicitations, as the French say. This was a classic example, I think, of a Pyrrhic victory. Yeah, you win the battle, but you lose the longer war for not only hearts and minds, but also for the legitimacy of your regime. Can you flip once? Yeah, that'll work. Following the Yellow Vest protests and following the labor unrest surrounding the pension reforms, these episodes have increasingly focused on the legitimacy of French democracy itself. The question about whether or not the republic can survive is not about how much we make or when we retire or how much we pay or how much we earn. It's about whether we want to be here anymore, whether we feel that we have a place, whether we feel that we have a stake in the system and a place at the table. It is also not irrelevant to consider the fact that Macron's growing embrace, authoritarian neoliberal embrace, has delegitimized not only his own party, not only French political institutions, but the very idea of French democracy itself. Can you click on that link, Caleb? Some recent polling data, which should send chills down the spine of any establishment French presentation, French politician. There you go. So if you could scroll down to the first half, this is a poll taken, a week ago, that shows 68% disapproval of Macron and 30% approval, right? We're kind of used to these numbers in the US, right? Sort of, this is unusual, to say the least, right? In a country which has a sort of almost congenital faith in the wisdom of political leaders, right? And political elites. The idea that 2/3 of the country could think you're a loser is something that is worth noting. But if you scroll down to the bottom part of the screen, there's something even more alarming, namely the rise of the Rassemblement National, the far-right party of Marine Le Pen, formerly known as the National Front. This is a poll, the most recent one that I could find, of voting intentions in the next presidential election. You will see here, let me get my little pointer. You will see here, these are various sort of feckless center-right parties that don't really matter anymore. You have NUPES, which is the far left party led by Jean Mélenchon at 25%. You have La République En Marche, which is the former name of Macron's sort of so ostensibly centrist party. And here you have the RN at 24%. Voting intention for the far right party in France for the first time since Vichy. Well, that wasn't really a vote, but at least in terms of who holds power, really presents a non-trivial opportunity for the far right to gain power, which would fundamentally transform the character of French democracy. I'm not an odds maker, I'm not a betting guy, but if I were a betting guy, I would be reluctant to take 2-to-1 odds that Macron wins. Macron can't run because he's term limited, but that the center-right president wins in 2000 during the next election. I give it about a 1 in 3 chance that the RN wins in the next presidential election. Predictions are dangerous and risky, and I'm probably wrong. I hope I am. But these are numbers that should put fear in the hearts of any French Democrat. So what does this mean? And then I'll conclude here. What are the upshot of all of this? Well, nothing very positive, I'm afraid. One lesson from all of this, I suppose, is that democratic legitimacy depends not only on political transparency, but on a belief that voters' concerns are being substantively represented, that people are listening, that they have a voice in the system, not just a functional voice that they go to the ballot box every 3 or 4 years, but a real one. The public square, moreover, is not a metaphor. Well, it is a metaphor, but it's also a place. And it's a place where workers can gather to express their anger and discontent about being excluded, not only discursively, but almost physically from the public square. And finally, and perhaps most specifically to our current purposes, neoliberalism and authoritarianism are dangerous combination, right? If you're going to be authoritarian, you better give people the goods, right? You better adopt a version of the Roman model of bread and circus. You better give them a reason not to worry about where their next paycheck is coming from, because if they have to worry about that for too long, next time they'll come for you. I'm slightly over my time budget. I will stop there. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.